Morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. About to resume the Minefield with Waleed Ali.
Scott, I like it. but well, am I wrong about this? I mean, we need them, don't we, in order for our society to be imbued with some kind of enchanted meaning that makes them worth living in, really. Otherwise, we end up with something that is purely brutish and competitive and ultimately sterile. But once we have them, they tend to create these monstrous problems, these areas, these pockets of monstrous injustice or misery that we seem incapable of solving. So what do we do?
I mean, that's a hard question. I mean, I think they do both, Waleed. I mean, if you look at, say, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it picked up on some of the foundational ideas that defined American nationhood and used those ideas to prosecute a compelling case for freedom and equality for African Americans. Well, what we're seeing here, I think, is, I mean, the NRA refers to itself as a civil rights organisation, which grates with me personally, but they are using some sort of formative ideas and principles that also underpin nationhood to prosecute a very different kind of case that is, as you've observed earlier today, unpalatable to most people and not comprehensible to most people outside of the United States, but that means something, that is quite deep, goes to the heart of what it means to be American for a lot of citizens, regrettably.
I've got to confess, I'm really torn on all sorts of fronts here. Because, I mean, Waleed, I love your idea of the blind spot. I guess I'm still a little bit too Augustinian, though, to accord that blind spot too much positive meaning. Remember Augustine's famous idea that there is no such thing as evil, there's just a good that's gone perverted or that's been distorted. It seems to me that what we're actually looking at with these constitutive national blind spots isn't so much a positive thing, much less a way of making a particular national story coherent, but we're seeing something that could otherwise be good simply be deformed, simply go feral. So it's citizenship. I mean, I think the gun ownership is the deformation of citizenship in the U.S. I would say that the way that we narrate indigenous history and the way that we understand asylum seekers here is a deformation of the notion of nationalism.
I think that is a slightly different case, isn't it, though, the Australian case? There's less that's productive about that, I would argue. But in the US case, if you said instead this is not a conversation about guns, but this is a conversation about freedom and all of the terrible things that freedom brings, the price that you must pay for that freedom, but nonetheless that it is such a grand, great concept that it is worth paying that price. That is a more productive way of framing it. Now, that's not where my leanings are on the issue of gun control, by the way. but I'm making a point that, it's possible here that you would look at this and say, yes, this is horrible, yes, this is a tragedy, but we accept that in the service of something that is magnificent.
But basically, this is the other point on which I'm torn, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, Michael. That I'm not sure. I mean, we often hear that part of the robustness of the American tradition is that different groups can appeal back to founding principles, and so you have, for instance, what Martin Luther King Jr. did, and going right back to the founding stories and even the geographical, eroticism of the nation itself, and using that as a way of arguing the case for the extension of voting rights and civil rights to African Americans. This is where I think we actually run aground on that idea of kind of competing national stories. If you contrast what Martin Luther King did with what someone like James Baldwin did, and James Baldwin is front of mind at the moment because last week I saw this extraordinary documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. I mean, I've always loved James Baldwin, but that documentary just sort of blew me away. What he did is delved deeply down into the very wrongness of what it means to be white itself. There was no kind of countervailing advancement of black power, and at the same time, there wasn't any going back to sort of founding principles of the nations. Instead, there was just a relentless criticism of the ontological state of whiteness itself. I'm just wondering, is maybe that a more productive way of going forward, rather, even on the issue of guns, finding something radically wrong with the very attachment rather than putting forward these competing national narratives?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I mean, if you go back 25 years, 30 years, you had Republican presidents and Republicans in Congress who were actually arguing for what I consider to be sensible gun regulation measures. I actually think something has happened in the last 30 years in US political culture that is driving this debate or lack of a debate that we're expressing such concern about at the moment. I mean, if you look at the NRA, you know, as late as the 1960s, the NRA was actually promoting, you know, what it referred to as gun safety, and it was actually quite crucial in LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, passing the Gun Control Act of 1968. I actually think something has happened that's rather dramatic in the last 30 years to change this. I mean, we've got 5 million members of the NRA today. We've got 55 million gun owners in the country. There are 300 million guns in circulation. I suppose what I'm suggesting is that it's not a linear kind of thing from 1871 when the NRA was established, or even further back, you know, to the foundation of the nation in the 1780s to the present day. I think something is different about today, and I think that political culture that we see in the United States, and that in many ways that Trump embodies, is really the heart of the issue in front of us.
I wonder if what you're effectively describing there is a kind of hyper-narrativization, aren't you? There is always this idea of freedom being the animating or the organizational principle of the United States, but it's now become something else. It's like it's suddenly on steroids and it's throwing off all these perverse outcomes. I get that as an idea. I wonder if that has to do with the age of hypercapitalism, that in order for a countervailing, meaning-giving narrative to hypercapitalism, you needed a hyper-narrative. And that's kind of where we've landed on this. I mean, guns is not the only example. I think you could probably trace a similar thing in American attitudes to healthcare and the politics around healthcare, because it becomes a harbinger for an oppressive state that becomes too big and too involved in people's lives, which from a place like Australia just looks absurd. I mean, you look at it and say, no, state can provide healthcare and life goes on. Actually, it's quite good.
I think what's sorry. Oh no, I was just going to say, I think what's so interesting about that is it's not just that these narratives provide meaning; it's that they provide consistency, and that the only way of then providing consistency from afar, if you like, is for that consistency to be wafer thin, to be incredibly shallow, and not bear up to scrutiny or the lived experience of local communities. And I think, Willie, that the whole issue of healthcare is so interesting because it's in precisely those states and those districts that have been most intractably opposed to the idea of universal healthcare, where universal healthcare is now being so prized. So I think here there's a kind of messy locality that needs to be evoked in order to overcome this kind of confected consistency.
Guys, can I suggest that the media is incredibly important here as well? I mean, in the early 90s, people were saying that the internet was going to democratize information, and it certainly has democratized information, but not necessarily the quality of information, so that people can go and get the news that confirms what they already think and what they already feel and what they think they already know. And I don't think it's a coincidence that political debate in the United States, and I think you can make this point to some degree in other countries as well, that political debate seems no longer to be a contest between who's right and wrong, but between who's good and who's bad, between who's good and who's evil. And if your opponent is evil, you don't have to compromise. You don't have to reach across the aisle. You have to destroy him or her. And I think that overheated rhetoric that we've become so accustomed to is fundamentally underpinned and reinforced by the media at the moment and the way that it's operating in the United States.
Well, Michael, you began that comment by asking if you could bring the media into it, and since you're on the media and you're saying disparaging things like that, the answer is no. So I'll thank you to cease that commentary, which you'll have to do anyway. We don't believe in freedom here. We believe in power. No, but we do have to shut you up there, actually, because the show is about to end. But do hang around for the podcast. We'd like to get more of your thoughts on a little podcast extra that we do on this show. That is the voice of Michael Ondaatje, who's Professor of History and the head of the National School of Arts at the Australian Catholic University. This has been the Minefield. Scott, we're done for another week.
We are indeed. We'd love to hear.
Yeah, AmeriKa and their gun cultural foundational myth. They have problems with gun culture and their foundational myth because their foundational myth encompasses the fact that people showed up with guns and stole the land. Here in Australia, we have a foundational myth that suggests that Captain James Cook was the first person to discover Australia. And on the basis of Australia being undiscovered previously, therefore it was terra nullius, and thus and because it could be claimed by the English crown. And having been claimed by the English crown, it could then be colonised. You know what a colon is? It's a muscular tube full of shit. You colonise somewhere, you go and shit there. So that's what the British Empire did here in Australia. And because we in Australia know how bloody terribly easy it is for a bunch of people with boats and guns to turn up and colonise the place, we have a national paranoia regarding boat people. Thousands of people every year show up via aeroplanes and they merge into the community and disappear, and that's okay, no drama. Mandarin is the second most commonly spoken language in Australian homes apart from English. But if somebody shows up on a boat running away from murderous next door neighbours or invasions or politics or genocides or whatever it is that's going on back in the homeland that they can't countenance living in anymore, we decide that they're illegal aliens and we stick them in a concentration camp and send them mad for years at a stretch. Because they're never ever allowed to come to Australia because they arrived on a boat. But as regards guns, here in Australia, we have a different view of them to Americans. Here in Australia, the idea is that no citizen has any statistical need to carry weapons for their self-defence against other humans. Nobody has any statistical need. Therefore, nobody has any official right to carry any weapon for self-defence. The people who are allowed to carry weapons for self-defence are the police. They're not given weapons to enforce the law with. They can't run up to you and point their Glock at you and tell you to pick up that paper you just dropped. They're given weapons so that they can shoot back if anybody is so silly as to fire at the uniform of an officer of the Crown. The Crown being the hat belonging to the old lady in England. A representation of which is on the hat of every policeman. It's on the coat of arms on their shoulder. You shoot at one policeman, all the policemen will come down on your head and chase you down until they capture you and bring you to book. That means they bring you to the courthouse where you get to defend yourself and cross-examine witnesses. And if you are convicted, then you get sentenced. That's the system. The cop's not given the gun to shoot you because he thinks you are running away. That's not how it works. In America, the fact that the policeman can't be there to stop every crime from happening means the Americans assert their right to, unless they've had a previous criminal conviction or they're declared to be mad, assert their right to bear arms to defend themselves against their next door neighbours or the person down the road or whatever goes bump in the night, which is generally their partner or their kid. It's a paranoid nation. They are constantly prepared to defend themselves against the attack of somebody they haven't yet met. A whole bunch of them have got licenses for concealed carry, which means that every day before they go to the toilet, they strap on a gun, just in case they might need to shoot somebody. They don't know who they want to shoot, but they might want to shoot someone. And it really pisses them off when somebody who hasn't got a criminal record and who isn't black suddenly decides to go and get a shit pot full of guns, modify a dozen or 2 dozen of them with bump stocks, which allow you to destroy the gun while firing a couple of magazines fully automatic in the general direction of whatever you want to pepper with bullets. And he's gone and he's done a few dry runs, he's rented a few motel rooms, he's seen what the timing is, he's figured out that he wants to go out there and attack 22,000 country and western music fans. He was the son of a bank robber who'd been a mild-mannered accountant amassing a fortune of millions all of his life. And suddenly he just broke out and attacked the society, which put his father in jail and made him fatherless and miserable as a kid. Funny that, isn't it? Actions have consequences. Maybe his father should have been let out on day release a bit more often. Warble's on a lot to YouTube. Upload limit. Ciao.